Thank you for joining another edition of Bumps and Thumps. I'm Brian Ferguson. Today, we have a returning guest. He's a wrestling historian. If he doesn't know it, then it ain't factual. All right, that's all I'm going to tell you about this man. He's a great guy. He's a return guest. So if you're listening from before, we welcome back Mr. George Shire. George, thank you for coming on today, sir.
Always a pleasure. As I tell you all the time, I absolutely enjoy talking old wrestling. And
Yes.
I like your introduction, although I'm expecting you're going to want payment in the mail for the nice words. So, but yeah, I like to get things right, and you know that. So
Yeah, I do.
when it comes to the AWA, well, there's websites out there. They have things on them regarding the history and the titles and so on. And
Yeah.
a lot of times there's just so many errors in them, and it always bothers me that people rely on them and take it as gospel. And, you know, we always hear that old saying, don't believe everything you hear on the internet.
Yeah.
Well, when it comes to this, not only the AWA, but a lot of wrestling territories, the information that's available, if people just Google it, isn't always what it should be.
Yeah.
So it's fun when we can, and you know, I do this on my Facebook page, on my wrestling page, and I do it on the AWA wrestling page. We try to get it right. So good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you. And folks, if you don't follow George Shire's Time Machine or the American Wrestling Association Facebook pages, you really need to. If you're into professional wrestling, which if you're listening to this, I'm assuming everybody is. George, if somebody puts information out that is not factual, he will get on there and correct it. And he has all the information at his disposal. So if George says it, it's fact. It's not misinformation. So again, George, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I love your sweatshirt or your sweater.
I did it just for you.
I know you did. I appreciate it.
I wish that I could have a notebook with all the times that I got calls or I get calls over the years from the wrestlers themselves.
Yeah.
Wanting to know their own history.
Yeah.
Because they don't remember it or they didn't remember it.
Yeah. No, you're right.
It's crazy. It's crazy stuff. I mean, they want to know when they were in a certain territory or, you know, all kinds of stuff. So it's always fun when I can have those conversations. And Greg Gagne, I know you've talked with Greg.
I have.
And Greg, Greg and I think we talk 2, 3, 4 times a week. I talked with him yesterday again. And God bless him, Greg does not know one bit of AWA history. I mean, he doesn't remember when him and Jim won the titles. He doesn't remember anything that happened, and we talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
And the other day, a week back, he asked me who the first AWA tag team champions were. And when I told him, he said, really? Well, how did that come about? You know, it's like, okay, Greg, we'll tell you, but he's great.
He is. I actually met him in person finally at Crusher Fest. It's the t-shirt.
Yeah.
Him and Jim Brunzell.
Yeah, Jimmy's great too.
Nice gentleman. Actually got to spend time with him outside of the festival. Absolutely fantastic gentlemen, both of them. Have nothing but high regards for both of them. And they have a very high regard for you because they know and we talked about you and they said, they said if George says it, that's what it is. So yeah. Speaking of which, let's talk about the American Wrestling Association today. That's our topic. There's a lot of information about how this territory was started, who was the first actual champion. Can you go through that with us? How it was formed, how it was started, and who the first champion was and how that came about, if you don't mind.
Well, when we talk about the AWA, I want to share with you kind of an inside thing that most of the wrestlers themselves, back in the territory days, and you're probably aware that at any given time, there were 25 or 30 individual territories around the United States.
Yep.
The AWA was one of them. When the wrestlers came to the AWA, and even before it was the AWA, they would always say, when I went to Minneapolis, or I went up to Minneapolis. What they mean by that is they're talking the AWA. Minneapolis was the headquarters. The offices for the AWA were located in downtown Minneapolis back in the day. And then later on in the 70s, they were out in St. Louis Park at a big office building complex they had, where Vern had offices for a while. But for the most part, they were in downtown Minneapolis. And so the wrestlers will say, well, when I went to Minneapolis, that's the AWA. So if I say that in my conversations, no, that's what I'm referring to, that they're talking the entire AWA.
Okay.
Back in the 50s, from the, well, during the late 30s into the 40s through the 50s, Minneapolis, after 1948, was an NWA territory, part of the NWA territory. The NWA, for those fans that know this, was formed in 1948 by a group of promoters, Wally Carbo being one of them, Sam Muchnick, that's a name most people would recognize, and Pinky George, and there were a few others that got together and decided they were going to form the National Wrestling Alliance. And their idea is that we would have one champion that they would vote on, and then that champion would be booked and go to the various cities with the promoters that paid dues to the NWA. So just to clarify, the NWA was never actually a territory. It was a champion. They never recognized tag team champions officially in the NWA. There were territories that said they had NWA champions, but they weren't officially recognized by the NWA. The NWA basically was a champion. And so each year at their annual conventions, the promoters would get together and talk about who they wanted to either continue with the champion they presently had, or do they want to change that champion and put the belt on a new guy. Lou Thez was the first NWA champion. He had been, and NWA was National Wrestling Alliance. Lou Thez, before this, had been recognized as a world champion, and it was the National Wrestling Association. So technically he was NWA champion there too, but because he was that champion, they decided they were going to hold a tournament match, elimination match. And it was going to be a #1 challenger, Orville Brown, and Lou Thez. They were going to meet with the winner to be the Alliance champion, National Wrestling Alliance champion. Well, before that match could take place, Orville Brown was in a serious car accident, and it ended his wrestling career. So they just decided they were going to put the title on Lou, and Lou became the first NWA Alliance champion. So during the 50s, for most of the 50s, he had like a 6-year, 7-year run. And he would come into Minneapolis because Tony Stecker, who was the Minneapolis promoter at the time, during the late 40s and into the 50s. Tony, by the way, was the brother of a former great shooter, professional wrestler, Joe Stecker. You can go back to the early 30s and find Joe Stecker's name as being one of those guys that was the real deal. So Tony Stecker was his brother. He was the Minneapolis promoter. And he would bring Lou in. I mean, not often, but at least once or twice or 3 times a year And this is back in the days, Brian, when Minneapolis territory ran weekly cards, sometimes 2 cards a week.
Okay.
Fans were really privileged in those days. We could get a card in Minneapolis on a Saturday night and have a St. Paul card on a Tuesday night, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And they would play the storylines off of these particular cards. So Tony Stecker was the promoter. In 1954, when Tony passed away, his son, Dennis Stecker, took over the Minneapolis office. And along with him was Wally Carbo. Now, Wally had been on and off referee for Tony during the early 50s. Wally became his matchmaker. Matchmaker in those days is another term for the booker.
Okay. Yeah.
That makes sense for the modern day fans.
Yeah.
So the matchmaker was the term they used. And Wally would come up with a lot of the finishes of the matches, and, work with the wrestlers on what they were going to do in a particular match at the end and all that. Saying that, I just want to clarify that most of the time the wrestlers went in and just did a match.
Yeah.
They worked it out themselves, but they had the finish, so they knew how they had to get to it. That's what they did. So they were, Wally and Dennis, from about 1955 on, were the Minneapolis wrestling office, Dennis Stecker and Wally Carbo. Well, Vern Gagne, he's a hometown boy. And in 1949, when he made his pro debut, he made it in Minneapolis on May the 3rd, 1949, beating a veteran wrestler at that time, Abe King Kong Cashy. And even though in 1949, King Kong Cashy was, I think you could say he was near the twilight of his career, but during the 40s and into the late 30s, I mean, he was their Bruiser Brody type guy of that era, King Kong Cashy.
Yeah.
So Vern beat him in his debut. Cashy put him over. Of course, Vern could have beaten him anyway if he'd have wanted to, because Vern was the real deal.
Right.
He had that real hooker shooter skill.
Yeah.
So during the 50s, Vern did a lot of traveling. He traveled around to Texas and to Oklahoma and out to California and into New York, and he was in Florida, and he was earning his oats, so to speak, as a junior heavyweight. He had been the NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion, which is the only other title the NWA Alliance ever recognized aside from their World Championship, was their Junior Heavyweight title. And Vern held that for a while. As we get into Vern's career then in the 50s, it became evident that Vern was wanting to be the world champion. And there was always, this is the story that goes around, whether there's fact or fiction involved. Lou didn't want to wrestle Vern for the title, with the title at stake. And they had a mutual respect for one another. Both of them extremely well-versed in the shooter style matches. So they could work with each other and really test one another.
Yeah.
And Lou didn't want to put the title on Vern. The NWA excuse being that, well, Vern was a junior heavyweight, so he's too small. Well, Vern was 6 foot, usually billed at around 220, 225, give or take. And they had about, I've got it listed down, Lou and Vern actually wrestled in their careers before the 60s, probably about 6, 7 times. And usually Lou got the nod. I mean, he won. And there were a couple of draws in there. But as we got into the later 50s in Minneapolis, Dennis Stecker was wanting to get out of it as far as the promotion part of it. And Vern saw the opportunity in his hometown to maybe buy in or buy the promotion, the territory from it. Now, another interesting little thing was taking place at the same time in the latter part of the 50s. The National Wrestling Alliance was actually under investigation by the United States Justice Department for having a monopoly. There were different promotions and things that went forward and said, you know, they're holding us up. We can't get the champion. You know, they control him, so on and so forth. So the Justice Department was actually getting their nose into this.
Yeah.
So in 1959, to kind of silence the lambs, so to speak, Sam Muchnick and the NWA decided that they would give up Minneapolis as an NWA territory. Well, this just opened the door for Vern because he was buying into it with Dennis Stecker at the time. So Vern and Wally Carbo, they bought Minneapolis from Dennis. Dennis was gone. In 1959 until August of 60, actually this happened in about September of 59 when they purchased the territory from Dennis. And so for the next year, the wheels were in motion. Vern wanted to be the world champion. Now it was his territory. He had no longer ties to the NWA because they had given up the territory. And he decided he was going to make himself the world champion.
Yeah.
Now there are people out there will say, you know, the people that don't understand, the newer fans that don't get this, they'll say, well, yeah, sure, he owned the company, he can make himself champion, you know, that's not fair, and so on and so forth. The reality of the thing is that in that time period, there really was no other wrestler that when you talked about being the world champion had better credentials than Vern Gagne. And I want to back up just 1 second. Sure. One of the things that the NWA did, and Lou Thez did this so well. Lou was one of those individuals that he wasn't really in favor of the showman in wrestling. He understood the characters and somebody needed a gimmick and that sort of thing. But Lou wanted to always be with the basics. He wanted to be the real deal. And Lou would always, outside the ring, you'd see him dressed to the nines in a suit, tie, always looking good when he was out on the street. You know, he wasn't running around in blue jeans and flip-flops and that sort of thing. And he always respected the business. He said, you know, I'm the champion, I should look the part. And the NWA also always had Lou fly first class to the cities. You know, it wouldn't make, and he would fly first class. It wouldn't make sense if he was the world champion. He had to sit and coach with a couple of big fat guys sitting next to him, you know. So they portrayed this thing really well. And Lou did that.
Yeah.
That was also important to Vern. Vern believed that the world champion should be a wrestler. Yeah. And he emphasized that. Now, Vern had that amateur background. He had been an alternate on the 1948 Olympics. He wrestled in high school in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. He played football for the Minnesota Gophers, was a standout with the team, Minnesota Gopher football team. And even had an offer to go and play with the Chicago Bears. But he liked wrestling. He wanted to follow through with that. And he realized at that time that he could make more money. So that's how he got into wrestling.
Okay.
So when 1959 comes along and Vern is thinking about making himself world champion. Well, obviously he was smart and he had to come up with a good storyline to make this happen. He didn't want to just come out and say, I'm the champion. He wanted to be able to say, I earned it. So there was, and this is where the websites out there, the wrestling websites and different title histories, where they get this a little bit wrong.
Okay.
Pat O'Connor at the time, when Wally and Vern bought the territory, Pat O'Connor was then the reigning NWA champion. So in 1959, he actually O'Connor made a couple of title defenses when it was still NWA territory here in Minneapolis.
Okay.
And I remember one of them, I was just a little kid, but Kinji Shibuya was one of his opponents. So the fans knew O'Connor, and he had wrestled here in the 50s as well before he got to the title. So they put out, as Vern is getting ready to launch his new company, AWA, with the blessings of the NWA, they put out a fictional storyline. I mean, wrestling is fictional to begin with, but they also added a fictional storyline. It's great. The storyline was put together in May of 1959, and Minneapolis was still NWA at that point.
Mhm.
The challenge was put out to the NWA and to its champion, Pat O'Connor,
Okay.
that Wally Carbo and other promoters, is the way it was worded. And they did this on All-Star Wrestling TV and also in the Minneapolis and the St. Paul wrestling programs that were sold at the arena matches. That they had issued a challenge to the NWA and Pat O'Connor that Vern Gagne is challenging Pat O'Connor, and he wants a match within 90 days, or Wally Carbo and the other promoters will no longer recognize the claim of Pat O'Connor as world champion.
Okay.
Now, bear in mind that Pat was the NWA champion. And on these websites, for those fans, you can Google them, and I hope you don't, because there's a lot of other errors in them as well. But when you Google it, they're going to say Pat O'Connor was the AWA champion.
Yep.
And he held it for 99 days or something, recognized. Well, that isn't true. So this 90-day challenge goes out in May of 1960. Well, the 90 days pass, and during the course of the time, there was a couple of things in the program that, we still have heard no word back from the NWA. Excuse me. It appears that Pat O'Connor is maybe ducking champion or number one challenger Vern. So when we get to August of 60, the challenge goes unanswered. And it is announced that by default, Wally Carbo and the other promoters will no longer recognize Pat O'Connor as the champion. And Vern Gagne is the first recognized American Wrestling Alliance champion. Now, in that very beginning era, it was alliance, not association, which it later became towards the end of the 60s, early 70s, which I have pointed out, there was no fanfare about this. There was no announcement. It just became association later.
Yeah.
American Wrestling Association. But it was American Wrestling Alliance. Excuse me again. See, I talk too much and then I get a frog in my throat.
That's all right. I wanted to touch base real quick.
So now go back and we'll leave it at that until you got questions.
No, I have a question. I have a couple questions, actually. One is, you brought up something that I didn't understand until you just brought up, and that's the fact that World Tag Team Championships, when you look at history, says Omaha version, San Francisco version.
Yep.
Now I understand why, because I always wondered, really, and I did some research on it, I never really found anything, is why are they calling it Omaha version? Why are they calling it San Francisco version? Well, you just brought it up because they didn't recognize the World Tag Team Championships. So when those territories did them, they said Omaha version, San Francisco version.
And the best way to define that is when the NWA, like I said, the NWA was a group of promoters. There were no territories. There were territories that would recognize and agree to be part of using that man as their champion.
Right.
So, there were probably 15 or 16 individual cities around the country that ran, or little territories that ran wrestling that were part of that NWA group. And once or twice a year, 3 times a year, they would get the NWA champion to come in.
Yeah.
And when that champion did that, you'll probably hear the term at some point as you follow wrestling, where they called the NWA champion a traveling champion, because he didn't work for a particular promotion, he basically worked for Sam Muchnick or whoever was the president of the National Wrestling Alliance. And he got his bookings from that person. And he went around to all these other cities and would go in and wrestle against their top challenger, whether it be a baby face or it could be a heel. And in general terms, the NWA champion was versed enough where when they went into a particular town, if they were wrestling against the top baby face of that city, then the champion would naturally be more the heel in the match. Lou Thez was good at playing that role. Pat O'Connor had to do it, and Pat was one of the greatest baby faces in the business. But he would do it. So did Dick Hutton when he held the title for a while. And then later on in the 70s, you know, we hear about Harley Race and Terry Funk and Dory Funk and Jack Briscoe. They all had to play that heel role sometimes, depending on the city they were in.
Right.
But as far as the NWA Tag Team Championships, there's where you'll see all kinds of NWA champions recognized in title histories, but it will say Florida version or San Francisco version or that sort of thing, because the NWA did not recognize champions, but that particular promoter, because he used the NWA World Champion, he could put tag team champions together. So there's NWA champions. I mean, try to trace that title history. Holy cow, there's zillions of champions all at the same time.
Yeah. I got a question for you. You said earlier about it was an alliance, American Wrestling Alliance, and then it went to association. What was the name change for? Was that for business reasons or was it just?
That is
unknown?
something I don't know. You know, it's a strange thing because all of the All-Star Wrestling TV programs and all of the arena printed programs were always, and it was always referred to as Alliance.
Okay.
As we get to the end of the 60s, and then for sure into the very early 70s, all of a sudden in print and on TV, it was association. There was never any mention as to how this happened. And it's a funny thing because I brought this up one time many years ago to Vern himself, why he changed it. And his comment to me was, it was always association. Well, I wasn't going to argue with the champ who could put a sleeper hold on me and end my life. So, but the idea is that it wasn't always association, but promoters, bless their hearts, they were a strange breed in that they only want fans to remember what they want them to remember. And if they tell you it was a certain way, then that's the way it was. So in Vern's world, it was always association. But I actually have I guess they're called the Articles of Incorporation for the AWA, American Wrestling Alliance. And trust me, it was American Wrestling Alliance. And it was until I noticed it appearing in programs and kind of being referred to sometimes as Alliance and then sometimes as association for a short time. And eventually in the 70s, the Alliance didn't exist anymore. So to answer your question, there was no announcement of it. It just happened. And according to Vern, it always was, but it wasn't.
Right. I was going to say, I had a photo. I don't have it anymore, unfortunately. When I was a kid, when the Midnight Rockers won the tag team championship the first time, and they had a photo, you could actually read on the belts, it said American Wrestling Alliance.
Yep.
And I wish I still had that picture, but.
Well, I have several, the publicity photos and that sort of thing with the first tag team belts that Vern used were the ones that Mad Dog and Butcher Vachon had in 1969. And those belts have American Wrestling Alliance on them. And then also, those are the same belts that Nick and Ray had later on, the High Flyers had, so on up until the Road Warriors, which, you know, were pushing into the 80s. They also had those original belts before they got new belts.
Right.
And if I'm not mistaken, the new belts also set alliance.
That's what I'm talking about. Those
Yeah.
belts.
There you go.
'cause
So,
yeah. Interesting.
and there was a story that went with that. Reggie Parks, folks know that Reggie Parks
Yep.
made title belts.
He did.
And Vern had commissioned him to make new championship tag team belts, the ones that the Road Warriors were the first ones to wear.
Mhm.
Reggie told the story later on that he had made the belts because Reggie worked for the AWA Alliance during the 60s and even a little bit in the 70s. And he says he got the call from Vern. He wanted these belts. This is kind of the outline he wanted, and he had them. So Reggie made them. And when Vern got them, they said Alliance on them. And Reggie says, well, that's what it is. And Vern also kind of questioned Reggie. No, it's association. So, God bless Vern. He believed differently, but you can't change history.
No, you can't. Speaking of belts, so the Inmate Belt.
Yes.
Can you tell the story of that? You hear different things. Can you kind of enlighten us on this story of how that belt was created and all and things
Well,
of
the
that
belt
nature?
was created because I don't have a picture here handy with me right now,
Mhm.
but Vern Gagne used to wear, and Mad Dog Vachon, when he was champion, he also wore it for a little bit. It was a belt that was presented to Vern Gagne in the 50s by the Police Gazette magazine. And
Okay.
it was a very nice, attractive championship belt.
Yeah.
And that belt was the one Vern was wearing in the 70s. In 1974, in Davenport, Iowa, the championship belt was on a ringside table during one of Vern's title matches. And there was a ringside fan who ran up, grabbed the belt, and tore out of the building.
Oh,
And it
no.
was reported in the newspapers. I have the clippings, the newspaper clippings and everything. This was an actual crime.
Yeah.
The belt had been stolen. Now, this particular belt from the Police Gazette people had actual little jewels and things in it. Is a very attractive belt.
Mhm.
I'm gonna hang on here because I'm gonna, as I'm talking, I'm gonna try to see if I can find that belt for you.
Okay.
So the belt is stolen. So for a few months, close to a year, Vern doesn't actually have a title belt. The belt was later found in a trash can somewhere in
goodness.
Iowa. This is, again, it's all documented with newspaper clippings and things. The belt was actually found, but all the jewels had been taken out of it.
Oh no.
Vern had estimated at the time, now this is back in 1974, 75 era. Vern had estimated, according to the reports, that the belt was worth $10,000 with the jewels as they were in the belt.
Mhm.
So the belt is found. And it's basically damaged, no good. So Vern didn't use a belt for the last few title defenses that he had in late 74 into 75. And he wasn't wrestling really full time at that point anywhere as champion. In 1975, on November 8th, when Nick Bockwinkel won the title from Vern in St.
Mhm.
Paul, it's a match, we just had the anniversary date here the other day,
Yeah.
46 years.
Wow.
And I can tell you, I sat ringside for it. And I remember it like it was the day before yesterday. But
Wow.
Nick didn't have a title belt when he won the championship, of course, because there wasn't one. And it wasn't until about 6 or 8 months down the road until that inmate belt, as it became known as. And the reason it was called an inmate belt was because it was made by prisoners at the Oak Park Heights prison facility here in Minnesota,
Oh, wow.
Stillwater prison territory area. So it was actually made by inmates. and very attractive belt. Now you've got
Yeah.
a duplicate, of course.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah.
it was really a very nice belt. And that was the one that Nick then held and wore for the next 5 years as champion,
Yeah.
almost 5 years, till
Yeah.
Vern took it back for a year, and then Vern retired. Then Ricky Martel, Jumbo Sharuda, they had that belt for their little coffee break title reigns, until it finally got to Stan Hansen. And that's where the fun begins with that belt. Stan was the champion. And
Yeah.
man, I tell you what, Brian, we could do an entire podcast on that whole storyline, because it's one of those times in history where fans, we obviously all got different stories, different versions of what happened between Vern and Stan.
Yeah.
But the long story short is Vern in 1985 was kind of working against some desperate measures, because those fans that remember that part of the history was when Vince McMahon was raiding all the territories.
Mhm.
He had raided Vern Gagne's AWA the most, taken most of the talent. And Vern was struggling, like all the other promoters, to keep the fans coming in with new talent. Stan Hansen at that particular moment, he along with Bruiser Brody, they were strictly independent guys. They would not work for a promotion.
Mhm.
They wanted to go in, they wanted to dictate their terms, their money, what they were going to do, but they drew money. I mean, when you had Hansen or Brody on your card, they were huge.
Yeah.
They were both big over in Japan. And that's where they made the majority of their money at that particular time frame. They were making big money over there to wrestle over there a lot.
Yeah.
So Vern needs to come up with a big, colorful, national hot name to hold his title. Stan Hansen didn't fit Vern Gagne's mold as a champion, because Vern always wanted, remember, to have a wrestler, not a performer, not a character. I mean, he had a couple of, like what couple times when the Crusher held it briefly, but Vern wanted wrestlers. So he goes to Hansen. This is name recognition. The problem is that Hansen was under contract to Giant Baba in Japan.
Mhm.
That's where he was going over, returning. He did these 6, 7, 8 week trips, and he'd go back and do them again and do them again. His allegiance, his alliance was to Baba. And I respect that. But Vern wanted to put the title on it. So there was an agreement being that, you'd still be able to make your Japan performances, and we're going to put the AWA title on you. And Vern wanted that because it was, again, name recognition. It made sense in that respect. So Hansen becomes our champion. Well, as the year went on, Stan was more and more not being available to Vern. And because Vern would want him to not go to Japan, Stan would want more money. And it just got into the point where finally Vern made the decision. Now, this is where it got a little hairy, because they didn't tell Stan Hansen, they meaning Vern and Wally at the time, Carbo. They didn't tell Stan Hansen until the night of a title defense with Nick Bockwinkel that was going to take place in Denver, Colorado. And so that before the match was to begin, Vern and Nick went into the shower area of the locker room. Was always a good place to have a meeting where it was quiet. And Vern told Stan that he wanted him to drop the title tonight to Nick. Stan didn't agree with that. He said, ho, no. I'm taking off to Japan. And he was taking off. And that was Vern's concern. He was going to be gone like 8 or 10 weeks again. So Stan said, no, I'm going to Japan, and I'm billed over there as the AWA champion, and I'm not dropping the belt. Vern says, well, yes, you are. You're not going out of here as champion tonight. Stan, in a huff, took the belt, left the building, literally left before the match. So that fact is true. Now, this is where it gets tricky for a promoter. I don't know that if Vern expected that type of response, but obviously he had his main event just fall apart, of which there were, whatever number of fans in the Denver arena there. And he, by the seat of his pants, he made a decision. He went to the ring, Vern did, and he announced that by default, because Hansen had dodged, he put the storyline to it that Stan was afraid of Nick. He dodged him. He said he wouldn't defend, and he didn't show up for the match. So by default, Nick was the new champion. Stan went over to Japan, and in Japan, he wrestled as the AWA champion. They introduced him as that over there, and he had the belt. The reality is that at that particular time, he was not still the champion. Nick now was. And of course, Nick didn't have a belt again. He got the title for the second time and no belt again, just like the first time. But the part that gets tricky is that fans, they want to pull their own twist into it, and they say, well, Vern did it, armchair quarterbacking. It's always easy to do. He said, well, Vern shouldn't have just put the title on Nick. They should have had elimination matches. They could have had this. They could have done that. And of course, eventually it could have come to Nick, but he didn't do that. He just handed it to Nick. I don't disagree with that. I just say that in the heat of the moment, Vern made that impulse decision that by default, and put the storyline that Stan was afraid of him and Nick was champion by default. So Nick is then champion for the next year or so, and till Kurt Hennig and a few of the others came into it. Or actually it was, it was Kurt Hennig and some of the others that came into it. But that's where it happened. So with Stan Hansen, Vern then got his attorney involved, and he sent a wire to Stan Hansen that he wants his belt back. And Stan, for whatever reason, he was kind of like, F you, Ganya, that sort of thing. Because obviously he was done working with Vern.
Yeah.
And he took the title belt and drove over it with his pickup truck. And that's a true story. So the actual title belt was all run over with the big old pickup truck tire tracks, and the little jewels had been popped out, and he boxed it up and sent it off to Vern, and here's your belt. And so that was the story of the Inmate Belt.
I've heard that. You gave more details, which I really appreciate.
Well, and I'll point this out to you too. Again, some of the stories that go with it, fans will say, well, Vern had no right to tell him to lose the title that night when he was going over to Baba, because he worked for Baba. And I always just step back and say this. When Stan was in Japan, he worked for Baba, and Baba was his boss.
Yep.
When he worked in worked in the AWA, Vern was his boss.
Yeah.
In my world, I separate that. And in my world, as I grew up in life, and I worked in a bank for a million years, you did what they asked you to do. I mean, unless it was illegal, you did what your bosses asked you to do.
Yeah.
And they were the boss. And if you didn't like it, well, you can either quit, move on, which is what Stan did. Although he did it kind of in an angry kind of way. Yeah. But to those fans that say, he had more of an allegiance to Baba, I don't agree with that, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah.
In the AWA, Vern was his boss.
Yeah. And there's been other situations in other promotions where they were told to drop the belt, they get angry about it. But
well, and it's interesting, Brian, because you have to realize that the title belt take a guy like the Crusher.
Hmm.
Vern put the title on the Crusher for coffee breaks, as they call them,
Yeah.
3 times back in the 60s.
Yeah.
That's when Crusher was wrestling against Mad Dog, that sort of thing. Most of those were for title rematch type purposes to build it up and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But the Crusher never wanted to have the championship.
Really?
That's a
Wow.
true story. That is a
Wow.
true story. And here's the deal. Crusher, we know what a big draw he was.
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk AWA next to Vern, and sadly, I can show you on attendance figures that sometimes Crusher even outdrew Vern, which
Mhm.
wasn't settling well with Vern, but that's the way it was.
Yeah.
The Crusher was a huge draw. He did not need that title to draw people in. And he didn't want it because anytime a wrestler has a title belt in any territory, they have to then be available at the promoter's whim. They're doing what they want, going where they want, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the Crusher, if you followed his career through the 50s and into the 70s, there were many times when he would disappear for 3-4 months. You wouldn't hear from him. They always said the Crusher's out of action, so-and-so injured him, or he's been injured. Well, the Crusher wasn't really injured. The Crusher just took time off.
Yeah.
He took vacations. And then Vern would try to run wrestling cards and his attendance would drop a little bit. So he'd go to the Crusher and say, come on, Reggie, got to get you back in here. We'll do this storyline, that storyline. And there's another big house and a big run, promotion run. So
Yeah.
a lot of wrestlers didn't want championships. Now you look at the NWA title. Here's an interesting thing. We're really off on a tangent, but this is,
That's
I think
all
this
right.
is important. I think this is important for fans
Yeah.
to know. The NWA champion, when Harley raced, was NWA champion. Harley wrestled about 375 times a year.
Yeah.
Now, and it might have been even a few more days, or times. But the thing to remember is there's only 365 days in a year. Harley was wrestling every night of the week and sometimes double duties, an afternoon show and a late evening show. And Harley was living out of a suitcase. And that was basically why they called them traveling champions. Dory Jr. did this.
Mhm.
Jack Briscoe did this. Terry Funk did this. They were in Winnipeg one night, then be down in Florida the next night. Then they'd be in Houston. Then they'd be in California. Then they'd be up in Detroit. I mean, they were just all over.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of a grind, eventually it wears on it. If you look at the title history or the title reigns of the NWA champions, with but a few exceptions, you will see that generally speaking, the NWA championship was held for maybe 2 years to 3 years
Mhm.
max.
Yeah.
And by that time frame, Jack Briscoe, when he was champion for 2 years, that schedule that we're talking about, he literally went in to Sam Muchnick and he said, I'm done. I gotta take a rest. I gotta have, we gotta take the belt off. And that's where that stuff came from. The AWA didn't have that kind of a schedule,
Right.
but the NWA champion, I mean, it was treacherous.
Mhm.
And most of the champions, by the time they got done, they just needed time off.
Yeah, you say that. I've heard from a number of people that I've had podcasts with when they worked in the AWA that was a great thing about that, or they got time off.
Exactly.
They didn't grind for 375 days. Now they got, I think it was, they would say most of the time, May or late May to early June, they were pretty much off. And then they would start back up in July. And then the winter time was when they really made their money. They did the traveling, the treacherous schedule for those months in the winter time. Cause I was told Vern liked to, in the summer, he knew people wanted to be outside, didn't want to be in a building or whatever. So he kind of accommodated that. And
Well, and it wasn't just Vern in the upper Midwest here. You know, our summers are precious,
Yeah.
and we're lucky if we could get. We always tease in Minnesota. We say we have 5 days of summer in July, and then it's back to fall and winter. But yeah, people are out water skiing and, you know, swimming and going on vacations, and the kids are home, you know, from school. And so wrestling didn't always draw inside the building. And generally they would take a month or two off. But when you talk about that light schedule, Nick Bockwinkel always said this, that he basically worked 6 months out of the year. Well, that didn't mean that he had 6 full months in a row off.
Right.
It just meant that he'd wrestle 3 nights a week. He'd have 3 or 4 nights off. And in between, you know, he didn't have that hectic schedule. And he could have a week or 2 in between where he might have some time off, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that was the luxury of the AWA. Any wrestler, this has always amazed me. In the 60s and the 70s, any wrestler of that era, if you talked to them, they wanted to get to the AWA because we had just that great schedule where you could travel by car and it wasn't 6 hour, 7 hour, 12-hour drives. It was a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard that the AWA, as far as the schedule, top notch wrestlers, and they got paid well. They got the same pay as they would if they grinded for 375 days. Like
well, I tell you what,
those guys did.
Back on my deck in the backyard in 1996, Nick Bockwinkel sat with me out there, and he talked about that very thing when he was champion. He said that Fritz von Erich had given him a call and had talked about, would Nick be interested in getting the NWA title? And Nick told me, he says, I sat down real quick and I started putting numbers to the paper, did the math. He said, I looked at what Harley Race was making. Now, in the 70s, when Nick was champion, he was making, now again, keep in mind, this is the 70s, okay?
Right.
Nick was making about $250,000 a year as champion. I don't know what that equates to today's salary, but it's up there.
Yeah, it's up there.
Harley Race was the NWA champion at the time, and Harley was making about the same amount of money at the time. So Nick says, I sit down and I look at what Harley has to endure wrestling, you know, every night of the week, all over this place, where I can stay home here, be the champion, and work in my little circle. Winnipeg, Minnesota, Chicago, Milwaukee, Denver, you know, go to Omaha, maybe out to San Francisco, then back up to Iowa, you know, just stay there. And I make the same amount of money. He said, not only that, Harley had to handle his own expenses. So he says it was a no-brainer. And I had the better deal. And as he said, I had 6 months off.
Yeah, that's it's pretty amazing how, with the difference between one organization to another. One last question.
Oh, we can't be at the end already.
But I want to have you back, and I'm sending, it's an open invitation. So I hope that,
I'd come on once a week if you wanted to do it.
Yeah, well,
I have no life. It's wrestling. That's it.
Don't tempt me. Don't tempt me. But
the offer's there.
Okay. One question. We talked a little bit about tag teams. The 60s. Now, if I remember correctly, first tag team champions was Murder Incorporated. Is that correct?
Mills and Kowalski. Yep.
Mills and Kowalski. Give us a little bit how that came about.
I'll do that. Remember before we were talking about the NWA not recognizing champions, tag team champions. Well, when in 1959, end of 58, when Mills and Kowalski came back home here to Minnesota, Stan lived here. Tiny was here all through the 50s.
Mhm.
Tiny and Stan had done some traveling together as a team in 1958 into early 59. And they were in Australia, they were in Japan, out in California. They were billed as the international tag team champions. And they had
Okay.
some right to claim that type of recognition. So
Mhm.
when they came home in 1959, they originally came in billed as international tag team champions, but Dennis Stecker then recognized them as National Wrestling Alliance World Champions, Minneapolis version.
Minneapolis, yeah.
Okay. So up until August of 60, when the AWA was formed, Tiny and Stan were defending the NWA Tag Team Championship. And when Vern made his announcement about becoming the first AWA champion, he also said in our recognizing our first AWA champions, Murder Incorporated, due to the fact, and this is in programs as well, I have this printed out or in print form, that due to the fact that they were the reigning NWA champions, they are now AWA World Tag Team Champions. So they got that recognition.
All right. And I know I said one last question, but one more quick one. Where did the name Murder Incorporated come from? Do you know?
Actually, that was a name that Tiny Mills and his real brother, Albert Mills, used when they were a brother tag team in the mid 50s, earlier 50s. They wrestled as Murder Incorporated. So I don't know where Tiny and Al got it, although I will tell you this, Al Mills was the older brother of Tiny. And Al Mills wrestled, you'll see him billed in programs as Al Mr. Murder Mills. So I'm sure it was just a takeoff on that Murder Incorporated when he had his little brother Tiny, and Tiny was actually bigger. Tiny was about Tiny was about, you know, they billed him at like 6'8". I think he was probably 6'4", but he was a big guy for that era.
Yeah.
And Tiny actually started in the business. I think he was pretty close to in his 30s.
Oh,
You know,
wow.
he didn't start younger,
Yeah.
but he started later. But I'm thinking that's where the name came from, that they just stand in, because by that time, Al had retired
Yeah.
from the business.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. George, I want to thank you. I know it, I am going to have you back on, and we'll talk about that when we're done here. But thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And folks, if you listened before, come back. If you're new to this, subscribe, please. George is just a wealth of knowledge. And George, thank you again for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure, and please, let's do it again. You can
You
tell
bet.
I could just talk.
Oh, yeah.
And like I say, we can do other territories too.
You
It's
bet.
fun. Okay.
All right,
Thank
folks.
you, Brian.
You bet. Thank you. And folks, join us next time with Bumps and Dumps.